Before you count sheep, count mysteries.
Imagine committing one of the boldest crimes in modern history and getting away with it. Not for a week, not for a month, but forever. On November 24th, 1971, an ordinary-looking man boarded a commercial flight in Portland, Oregon. He carried nothing unusual. No weapon in his hand, no disguise. There was nothing about him that suggested that within a few hours, he would become the only airplane hijacker in American history who was never identified and never caught. More than 50 years later, investigators, journalists, and amateur detectives are still asking the same question. Who was D.B. Cooper? November 24th, 1971. If you had walked through Portland International Airport that afternoon, nothing would have seemed unusual. People were doing exactly what people still do in airports today. Some were rushing because they were late. Others were sitting with a coffee waiting for their flight to be called. Parents were trying to keep their children entertained. Business travelers were reading newspapers. It was the day before Thanksgiving, one of the busiest travel days in the United States. Airports all over the country were crowded, and that's probably one of the reasons this story was able to begin so quietly. Nobody was paying much attention to anyone else. Among all those travelers was a man who looked completely forgettable. That's not an insult. In fact, it may have been his greatest advantage. Witnesses later described him as being somewhere in his 40s, around 6 feet tall, well-dressed, calm, polite. The kind of person you might expect to see flying somewhere for a business meeting. He wasn't carrying a large suitcase. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. If someone had asked people in the terminal to point him out, nobody could have done it, because there was simply nothing memorable about him. He walked to the Northwest Orient ticket counter and asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle. The flight would last less than 30 minutes, barely enough time to finish a drink. He paid $20 in cash. Then he gave his name, Dan Cooper. Today, almost everyone knows him as D.B. Cooper, but that's actually the result of a mistake made by a newspaper the following day. The name D.B. Cooper was printed by accident, and it stuck forever. His real ticket, the one he purchased that afternoon, was issued to Dan Cooper. It's a small detail, but in a mystery like this, even the smallest details matter. After buying the ticket, Cooper didn't rush to the gate. He simply waited. No witnesses remembered him making a phone call. Nobody saw him meeting another person. Nobody noticed anything strange. Looking back, that's probably the most remarkable part. One of the most famous criminals in American history started his day looking exactly like everyone else. A few minutes later, boarding began. Cooper picked up his briefcase, walked toward the aircraft, smiled politely at the flight attendant, and stepped inside. No one on board knew it yet, but this short flight from Portland to Seattle was about to become one of the most famous flights in aviation history. Once on board, Cooper took his seat near the back of the aircraft. It wasn't first class, it wasn't even close, just another seat on another short domestic flight. The plane was a Boeing 727 operated by Northwest Orient Airlines. If you've ever flown somewhere that takes less than an hour, you know the feeling. People settle into their seats, put their bags away, maybe glance through a magazine, maybe close their eyes for a few minutes. Nobody expects anything interesting to happen. That's exactly how Flight 305 began. The cabin wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it felt normal. Some passengers were chatting quietly, others were reading newspapers. A businessman a few rows away was already looking through paperwork. Someone else was staring out of the window, watching Portland disappear beneath the clouds. Cooper didn't draw any attention to himself. In fact, If you had been sitting a few rows away, you probably wouldn't have remembered him at all. He ordered a bourbon and soda. That was it. No strange requests, no nervous behavior, no rushed movements, just a man having a drink on a short afternoon flight. Looking back, that's one of the strangest parts of this entire story. Almost every famous hijacking in history involved panic, shouting, weapons, chaos. But not this one. Cooper never raised his voice. He didn't stand up and make an announcement. Most passengers had absolutely no idea that anything was wrong, and that's because he only spoke to one person, a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. He handed her a folded note. At first, she barely looked at it. According to her later interviews, she assumed it was another passenger trying to flirt with her. That happened from time to time. So she slipped the note into her purse, planning to ignore it until after the flight. Cooper leaned slightly toward her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't threatening. He simply said, "Miss, you'd better read that note. I have a bomb." Those few words changed everything. Florence opened the note. We don't know its exact wording because the FBI never released it publicly, but we do know what happened next. Cooper quietly asked her to sit beside him. Then, without making a scene, he opened his briefcase just enough for her to look inside. According to Florence's testimony, she saw what appeared to be several red cylinders, connected by wires, and attached to a battery. Was it a real bomb? Nobody knows. It has never been recovered. But imagine being in her position. You're 20,000 feet in the air. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Whether the bomb was real or not, it didn't matter. She believed him. And from that moment on, every decision she made could determine whether everyone on board would make it home alive. Surprisingly. Cooper remained calm throughout the conversation. He didn't insult anyone. He didn't lose his temper. In fact, several crew members would later describe him as polite. That makes this case even stranger. The man committing one of the boldest crimes in American history never behaved like the criminal people imagined. Up until this point, only a handful of people knew that Flight 305 had been hijacked. The passengers had no idea. Most of them were still reading, chatting, or simply waiting for the short flight to end. That's what makes this case so unusual. Imagine sitting on a plane, completely unaware that just a few rows away, someone is calmly negotiating with the crew while claiming to have a bomb. Cooper never wanted attention. He wanted control. And those are two very different things. While Florence remained seated beside him, Cooper calmly explained exactly what he wanted. There was no hesitation. It almost sounded as if he had rehearsed the entire conversation dozens of times before. His demands were surprisingly specific: $200,000 in cash. Not a check, not a bank transfer, cash. He also wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes. Finally, he requested a fuel truck to be waiting once the aircraft landed in Seattle. That's it. No political statement, no speech, no explanation. He wasn't trying to become famous. He simply wanted what he had asked for. Florence carried the message to the cockpit. When the pilots heard what was happening, they immediately contacted air traffic control. Within minutes, the information reached the FBI. Suddenly, what had started as an ordinary 30-minute flight had become a national emergency. Back on the ground, investigators had to make a decision. Should they negotiate, or should they take the risk? The problem was simple. Nobody knew whether the bomb was real, and nobody wanted to find out, so authorities decided to cooperate. While Flight 305 circled above Seattle, people on the ground rushed to collect everything Cooper had demanded. Banks were contacted, airline officials worked alongside the FBI. Every minute mattered. One detail, however, immediately caught investigators' attention: the parachutes. Why ask for 4? At first, it didn't make much sense. But then investigators realized something. If Cooper had asked for only 1 parachute, authorities might have secretly replaced it with a defective one. But by asking for 4, he created the impression that he might force one of the crew members to jump with him. That changed everything. No one was willing to risk handing him faulty equipment if another innocent person might use it. It was a clever move. Whether Cooper actually planned it that way, we'll probably never know. But it worked. As the aircraft continued circling in the sky, FBI agents carefully recorded the serial number of every single banknote. There were 10,000 $20 bills. Each one was photographed, cataloged, and documented. Investigators hoped that one day the money would lead them back to the hijacker. They had no idea that decades would pass before even a small portion of that money would ever be seen again. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the passengers were still remarkably calm. Many believed the delay was caused by a technical problem. Flight attendants continued speaking to them normally. Drinks were served. Conversations continued. Looking back, it's almost unbelievable. Dozens of people sat on a hijacked aircraft and never realized it until much later. Finally, after nearly 2 hours in the air, Flight 305 received permission to land in Seattle. Waiting below was everything Cooper had asked for: the money, the parachutes, and the next chapter of one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in history. Once the aircraft landed in Seattle, everything happened surprisingly fast. The money was delivered. So were the parachutes. A fuel truck pulled alongside the aircraft. Cooper watched everything through the window. He wasn't in a hurry. He wanted everything done exactly the way he had requested. Once he was satisfied, he kept his word. Every passenger was allowed to leave the aircraft safely. Imagine being one of them. You step off the plane, maybe wondering why the flight had been delayed for so long, only to discover that you'd just been part of a hijacking. Most of them had no idea what had happened until after they reached the terminal. That's how quietly Cooper had handled the entire situation. But the story wasn't over. In fact, this was only the beginning. 4 people remained on board: Captain William Scott, First Officer William Radizak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow. Cooper collected the bag containing $200,000, examined the parachutes, and gave the crew their next instructions. He wanted to head south, toward Mexico. The pilots explained that the aircraft didn't have enough fuel to make the journey in one flight. Cooper listened. He didn't argue. They agreed to refuel again later in Reno, Nevada. Then came another unusual request. Cooper instructed the pilots to fly at around 10,000 feet, much lower than the altitude used on most commercial flights. He also wanted the aircraft flying as slowly as it safely could. If you've ever looked out of an airplane window, you'll know that passenger jets normally cruise far higher and much faster. Cooper wasn't asking for a normal flight. He was preparing for something. At 7:40 that evening, Flight 305 took off from Seattle for the second time. Outside, the sun had already disappeared. Rain swept across the aircraft. Strong winds moved through the mountains below. Visibility was poor. It wasn't the kind of night anyone would choose to jump out of an airplane. Yet that's exactly what investigators believe Cooper intended to do. A short time after takeoff, he told Tina Mucklow to join the pilots in the cockpit. According to her later testimony, he remained polite until the very end. There was no shouting, no panic, no threats. He simply asked her to leave. Once the cockpit door closed, Cooper was completely alone in the cabin. For the next several minutes, the crew had no idea what he was doing behind them. Then, a warning light appeared in the cockpit. It indicated that the aircraft's rear staircase had been lowered. A few moments later, the pilots felt a sudden movement, almost like a small jolt. Not violent, but enough to notice. No one spoke. No one opened the cockpit door. They continued flying exactly as instructed. Somewhere below them stretched hundreds of square miles of forest, rivers, mountains, empty wilderness. If Cooper really had jumped, there would be almost no way of knowing exactly where he landed. Nearly 2 hours later, the aircraft finally landed in Reno. Within seconds, FBI agents surrounded the plane. They rushed inside expecting to find Cooper. Instead, they found an empty cabin. The money was gone. Cooper was gone. All that remained was a black clip-on tie, a few personal items, and one question that would frustrate investigators for decades. Had D.B. Cooper really survived a parachute jump into the darkness? Or had he disappeared forever the moment he left that aircraft? By the time Flight 305 landed in Reno, D.B. Cooper was already gone. There was no dramatic arrest, no chase across the runway, no final confrontation, just an empty cabin, and a lot of confused investigators. At first, many people believe it wouldn't take long to catch him. Think about it. A man had just hijacked an airplane, demanded $200,000, jumped somewhere over the Pacific Northwest. Surely someone would find him. Maybe injured. Maybe hiding. Maybe trying to spend the ransom money. But that's not what happened. Instead, every answer investigators expected turned into another mystery. The FBI launched what would become one of the largest investigations in its history. The case was given its own name, NORJAC. Short for Northwest Hijacking, hundreds of agents worked on the investigation over the following years. Search teams combed through forests, climbed mountains, crossed rivers, and searched areas where Cooper was believed to have landed. Nothing. No parachute. No body. No bag full of cash. It was almost as if the ground had swallowed him. Investigators then focused on the aircraft itself. Every object left behind suddenly became important. His clip-on tie, his seat, even fingerprints collected inside the cabin. At the time, forensic science wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. DNA testing didn't exist in the way we know it now. Computers were limited. Many of the tools investigators rely on today simply weren't available in 1971. Even so, the FBI kept every piece of evidence. Decades later, scientists examined Cooper's tie using technology that didn't exist when the hijacking happened. Tiny metal particles were discovered trapped in the fabric. Some experts believe they were linked to industries such as aerospace or advanced manufacturing. It wasn't proof of who Cooper was, but it suggested he may have worked in a highly technical environment. Then there was the money. Before handing over the ransom, the FBI had photographed and recorded the serial number of every single $20 bill. It was a smart decision. Investigators assumed that sooner or later, A Cooper would spend at least some of it, a cashier, a bank employee, someone, somewhere would notice. Except they never did. Months passed, then years. Nothing. The money simply disappeared. If Cooper survived, why didn't he spend it? And if he didn't survive, where had it gone? Then, in 1980, almost 9 years after the hijacking, something unexpected happened. A young boy named Brian Ingram was playing with his family on the banks of the Columbia River. Like a lot of children, he started digging in the sand instead of finding shells or interesting rocks. He uncovered something nobody expected. Bundles of old $20 bills, water damaged, falling apart. When investigators checked the serial numbers, there was no doubt. They matched Cooper's ransom money. Finally, after nearly a decade, the investigation had found its first real clue. But strangely, the discovery solved absolutely nothing. If anything, it made the mystery even bigger. How did the money end up there? Why was only a tiny portion of it ever found? Where was the rest? And perhaps the biggest question of all, where was Cooper? Over the next 4 decades, the FBI investigated hundreds of suspects. Some looked incredibly convincing. Others were ruled out within days. Journalists wrote books. Amateur detectives created websites. Television documentaries offered new theories every few years. Yet no matter how many people study the case, the ending never changed. One man boarded a plane, one man disappeared into the night, and somehow, nobody has ever been able to prove what happened next. More than 50 years have passed since D.B. Cooper disappeared, and despite everything we've learned, we're still left with the same question. What actually happened after he jumped? If you ask 10 different people, you'll probably get 10 different answers. Some believe Cooper never had a chance. And honestly, it's easy to understand why. Think about the conditions that night. It was November, cold, windy, raining. He jumped into complete darkness, carrying a heavy bag full of cash. Below him, there were forests, rivers, and rough terrain stretching for miles. No GPS, no lights, no way to know exactly where he would land. Many FBI agents believed he simply didn't survive. If that's true, the mystery isn't where Cooper went. It's why nobody ever found him. But here's where things get interesting. Other investigators looked at the case very differently. They argued that Cooper didn't seem lucky. He seemed prepared. Think about everything he knew. He chose a Boeing 727, one of the few passenger aircraft at the time with a rear staircase that could be lowered in flight. He knew exactly how much money to ask for. He asked for 4 parachutes, a detail that may have prevented the authorities from sabotaging them. He stayed calm from beginning to end. He never panicked. He never rushed. That doesn't sound like someone making things up as he goes. It sounds like someone with a plan. That's why many people believe Cooper had military experience, or at the very least, knew a lot about aircraft and parachuting. Then there's another question, the money. Almost all of it disappeared forever. Only a small amount was ever found, buried along the Columbia River. Why? Nobody knows. If Cooper survived, why didn't he spend the money? And if he died, how did some of it end up there years later? It's one of those details that keeps pulling people back into this case. Every answer creates another question. Every clue opens another mystery. That's probably why this story has never really ended. Even today, new theories continue to appear. New suspects are still discussed. Books are still written. Podcasts are still recorded. And people are still trying to solve a crime that happened more than half a century ago. Maybe one day. Someone will uncover the piece of evidence that changes everything. Maybe Cooper's real identity is sitting in an old file somewhere, waiting to be discovered. Or maybe this is one of those rare mysteries that will never be solved. And strangely enough, perhaps that's exactly why we still find it so fascinating. Because sometimes the unanswered questions are more interesting than the answers themselves. Well, that's tonight's mystery. If you have your own theory about what happened to D.B. Cooper, I'd love to hear it in the comments. And if you enjoy true mysteries, unbelievable real stories, and the questions history still can't answer, make sure you join me for the next one. But until then, don't count sheep, count mysteries.